Our next speaker is Steve Walsh, who's a distinguished geographer at University of North Carolina and director of the Galapagos Center, or
Science Center?
Science Center there, and various other activities on Galapagos, working on things at the interface with the ecology in terms of land use, remote sensing, et cetera. So, Steve, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to learn about all the various projects that are going around across all the groups. So it's a real opportunity to compare what geographers are doing across other subfields as well. What I'm going to try to do today is focus on the Galapagos Islands and focus on primarily process understanding and how, by using dynamic systems and agent-based models and trying to look at human-environment interactions, we can try to understand processes that are affecting systems. I start with a picture of me. I'm the one with the hat on, by the way, and a giant tortoise in the Galapagos to indicate that the Galapagos, by and large, is thought of as an endemic place, iconic place, a Darwin's paradise, enchanted islands, all of the above. And it is that, and it's more than that. But this is what it has become. 225,000 tourists, 30,000 people living in the Galapagos Islands on 4 primary islands. And so the issue is now human-environment interactions, and it is trying to understand the resilience of social systems as well as ecological systems and how they relate. What we're showing here is one of the towns on the island. We see that the park is 97% of the land area of the populated islands. But in reality, we have direct and indirect consequences that spread well beyond the boundaries of the park and the boundaries of the settled areas. My presentation, I'm interested primarily in looking at linkages between the social, terrestrial, and marine subsystems. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the Galapagos Initiative that UNC has put forward in the building of the Galapagos Science Center as context to what we're trying to do in the Galapagos Islands, a natural laboratory. I'm going to try to look at 3 particular projects, the pushes and pulls out of agriculture to tourism and fisheries, implications for land abandonment and invasive species, the dynamic carrying capacity of the Galapagos Islands, a system perspective, and a request by the Ecuadorian government as to what is the carrying capacity before the environment is degraded. I'm going to look a little bit at fisheries and tourism, alternate household livelihood strategies and job switching, and finally at the end, after those very brief looks at these 3 case studies, trying to synthesize what did we learn and where are we heading. So first, the geography. As you know, the Galapagos Islands are 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador, where geographic isolation was the protection for years and years and years. It isn't anymore. It is now an archipelago brought to fame, of course, by Charles Darwin, but extending now to most people's bucket list to try to come and see the special place before it is degraded. It is also not only a national park and a World Heritage Site, it is also a marine reserve. And so fisheries for local people, endemic species, tourism, the pulse of life in the Galapagos used to be around fisheries, agriculture, and now it is increasingly about tourism. It is this unique place because of the juxtaposition of interacting currents, the warm water currents from Panama, the cold water currents from Antarctica, making their way to the Galapagos Islands, diverging off the coast of Ecuador, making its way to the 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador, having the Cromwell current, the countercurrent that brings upwelling to the Galapagos, providing the rich nutrients that support the species that have made the Galapagos such a special place. But it is also a volcanic landscape where land is being born and the land is being reformed through subsidence and topographic uplift, creating habitats where species occur in the shadows of volcanoes and no other place on the planet. Creating these iconic species that people come to see and realizing that the human dimension is going through an intense gyration trying to accommodate 225,000 tourists and 30,000 residents, the residents coming primarily from the Ecuadorian mainland for jobs in tourism. So there are pushes and pulls to the Galapagos. There are pushes and pulls off and towards the land. And what we see are special species, marine iguanas, hammerhead sharks, Galapagos penguins, that are there in immense numbers, and some that are very much threatened by what is happening by the human dimension. Because the human dimension now is afforded the luxury of airplane travel, boat travel, getting people to all parts of the Galapagos archipelago. And that brings the challenges of the human dimension, such as this 2001 sinking of a ship that was bringing diesel fuel for the cruise ships in the Galapagos, to the netting of hammerhead sharks as a consequence of global fisheries, to the expansion of the goat populations and the eradication of goat populations, and how the goat populations being brought as a food source have now caused tremendous stress on the iconic species such as the giant tortoise. So the human dimension is expanding. Here in this particular area, in 1963, 1985, 2001, and 2007, you can see the densification of the urban use areas in the Galapagos, and this is providing more and more challenge due to the lack of infrastructure, but also the feedback mechanisms between human behavior, environmental reaction, and environmental behavior causing human reaction. And so it is very appropriate to think of the Galapagos as a coupled human natural systems. It's not just about plants and animals, endemic and native. It is about the human dimension and how people are shaping and reshaping the environment as well as the social systems. The trends in tourism have been fairly robust. It is not so much the total number, it is the rate of ascent, rate of increase. Total tourism in 2010 was 185,000. Last year, tourism was 225,000. International tourists, 121,000. National tourists, which is a tremendous increase, is about 64,000. It is estimated that with the increase in tourism, we will have an increase in the resident population, again increasing in a dramatic rate. The link between tourism and the resident population is direct. Again, people are coming for the jobs in tourism. The pushes off the Ecuadorian mainland because of poor economy, the pull towards the Galapagos because of higher salaries. So part of this peopling of the Galapagos has been increased air traffic, increased cargo traffic, ships moving in perpetual motion from the Ecuadorian mainland to the Galapagos, bringing everything from water and batteries and potato chips and all sorts of consumables. And with that, bringing invasive species that are making their beachhead in the Galapagos, some being brought in purpose, others hitchhiking and making its way to the Galapagos. Having problems with the delivery of fuel and all the other consumables in the Galapagos are impacting the environment in fundamental ways. As I indicated, the last 15 years, tripling of the local population, 225,000 tourists, over 30,000 residents. In 2007, UNESCO placed Galapagos as a World Heritage Site at risk and endangered as a consequence of invasive species, population migration and tourism, and economic development versus resource conservation. 2010, it was taken off that endangered list or at-risk list, much to the chagrin of most of the conservation organizations in the Galapagos and those that confront issues in the Galapagos. We at the University of North Carolina had an opportunity to create a facility in the Galapagos to look at an interdisciplinary approach and to try to look more at human-coupled systems within the Galapagos by building a Galapagos Science Center. It was dedicated in 2011. It is interdisciplinary. Scientists from social systems, natural scientists, spatial scientists, computational scientists are brought together to try to understand coupled human-natural systems, but also to drill deep into marine sciences, terrestrial biology, and ecology. This is what it looks like. It is employed with permanent staff, mostly Ecuadorians. We do a lot of community outreach, summer study abroad for our students, undergrads, master's, PhD, dissertations, theses. It is connected with the University of San Francisco, Quito, the premier university in Ecuador, And thus far, we're fairly young, but we're moving forward and trying to understand the Galapagos as a natural laboratory and as a coupled system. The building is situated in a wonderful place that reminds us that it is a natural environment, but it is also one that is stressed by the human dimension in fundamental ways. The dominant questions are about sustainability. How can the social and ecological sustainability of a coupled natural system, human natural system, be achieved in the Galapagos Islands and beyond? We're looking at the Galapagos, but we're comparing it to other island ecosystems around the planet. What strategies can be developed that allow economic development and resource conservation to occur in a compatible and sustainable way that benefits people and the environment? What are the explicit and implicit links between patterns and processes? And what are the dynamics affecting the social, terrestrial, and marine systems with corresponding feedback mechanisms? What are the causes and consequences of the human environment system that we see occurring in the Galapagos Islands? And what are the important feedbacks and dynamics that we see in these systems? Sir, could you advance? This doesn't seem to be advancing. One more, please. One more, please. He's going backwards. I'm not. Yes. Our friend here has talked a lot about complexity theory, and so we've been using complexity theory. We've reframed it as island biocomplexity, as a way of trying to stress the importance of systems in the Galapagos Islands. We've been using agent-based models to try to understand human behavior and human characteristics. We've done a lot of work with trying to do social surveys to understand individual and household demographics. We've been looking at heterogeneous agents and frameworks for simulating agent behaviors and learning and decision-making in an area that is plagued with uncertainty, certainly. Endogeneity and exogenous forces and factors and dynamics are fundamentally important in the Galapagos and in most systems. And what we've been trying to do is look at how systems are evolving over time, having descriptions of behaviors and individual agents in the environment and how they are engaged in the feedback mechanisms that link people and the environment. One of the first projects, let me tell you about, is a small project that dealt with trying to understand land dynamics on Isabella Island, the island that looks like a seahorse in the Galapagos Islands. It was fairly simple programming. It was actually done in one of my graduate seminars on population-environment interactions. And it used a simple net logo program that looked at farmers, fishermen, tourist workers, park employees, and invasive guava as the agents of our landscape. The idea was to try to understand how guava is controlled and eradicated by the neighboring effects of farms, try to look at park guards and have they worked at eradicating guava as well as we look at protected areas. The idea is to look at how people in the Galapagos move between jobs. The enterprise is primarily fisheries, agriculture, and tourism. But the idea is that people move between and switch between these livelihoods based on opportunities and challenge. So this model looks at expected number of tourists, number of open fishing licenses as people move in and out of quota-based systems, selling price of fish and agricultural products, startup costs, cost of maintaining the property. And the idea is how do agents accumulate wealth, which gives them the power to move between jobs through job switching opportunities. So the ABM model basically looks at modeling approaches that integrate population and environment interactions, agent-based models that look at primarily livelihoods. And what we were trying to do is build base models that could be perturbed, increase agricultural subsidies, decrease global fisheries, decline in tourism, and how we could build a system that would give us indications of different alternatives in different scenarios of the future. So in this particular case, it was important only to have a stylized or virtual environment, not necessarily the original environment. And so in this case, we have the marine world surrounded by the urban context, by the water, and the agricultural highlands surrounded by the green area, which is the Galapagos National Park. The concept here is to basically look at endogenous factors and scenarios. So we were looking at global market shares. We were looking at policies from the UN, from the government of Ecuador. We were looking at environmental variations such as El Nino events and seed pulses dealing with invasive species. Political economic landscapes, and trying to look at the processes that we think would drive livelihood decisions dealing with land use and land cover dynamics. The idea is to look at guava, to look at how the land area is being updated with guava expansion, to look at issues such as land clearing and other kinds of decisions that farmers are making as they eradicate guava, as they deal with land abandonment as one possibility, particularly if they're pushed and pulled off the farmland to other jobs in tourism, which are making more income. The model has a simple template that allows the graduate students, and now I use this in my undergraduate Galapagos class, to look at alternate futures for the Galapagos by varying everything through sliders that would allow us to look at changes in subsidies, changes of El Nino events, changes in tourism, changes in residents, changes in commodity prices, and how those would yield different alternate futures for the Galapagos Islands. Some of the take-home is about agent behaviors. Many households can produce alternate responses to the same problem, and we see that in the Galapagos, and we see that in many dynamic systems, based in part on environmental settings, but also on socioeconomic characteristics and demographic characteristics at the individual and household levels. Human environment, people have memories. Farmers knew what happened during the last El Nino event. They knew about the shutting down of the fisheries. They looked at availability of fishers coming in working on farms. We knew about El Nino events and La Nina events and how that had to do with the spread of invasive species. So the idea of how to build in memory as an adaptive capacity within agents was something that this work also yielded. We also know that ENSO events are particularly significant in the Galapagos. It affects not only the marine systems, but the social as well as the terrestrial systems. And so when we're talking about engaging opportunities between the three sectors of population, environment, and human health, we see that played out through this particular case study as well. Well, let me jump to another. We were asked by the President of Ecuador in the Ministry of Tourism and Ministry of Environment, what is the carrying capacity of the Galapagos Island in terms of number of tourists before the environment severely degrades? We decided we would look at dynamic systems models as one particular approach. The properties include quantities that vary over time, whose variability is described causally, and whose influence is constrained within a closed system feedback. What we're interested in are stocks and flows and rates of change, feedback loops and rules of behavior. All of these fundamental within this particular project. So what we did is built a variety of these dynamic system models in the gray areas indicate what we tried to do, and looking at resident population, introduced species, protected area touristic management, land occupation, consumption of electricity and products, good importation. All of these are separate models that helped us understand the notion of how many residents and how many tourists could the islands accommodate before there were negative consequences on the environment, and what the strength and the relationships of the feedback loops were. In essence, trying to understand the quality of living space, attractiveness of the natural environment, the spread of invasive species, and how those are affected by tourists and by local residents with all these other inputs of infrastructure, transportation, water, energy, waste, food security, labor, within a dynamic system. In this particular case, trying to track and understand the population increases, to track that through time, and to listen to the Ecuadorian government as to what they wanted to look at. It may be a doubling of population. In this case, they looked at a scenario of going from 225,000 tourists to 400,000 tourists over the next 3 years. It seems improbable given the inadequacies of infrastructure, but that was one of the scenarios they wanted to test. They wanted to test no growth scenarios. They wanted to test moderate growth scenarios and high growth scenarios, and how those would play out in our models as we ran it through these various system dynamics, asking the question, what is possible, what is advisable? And so this is but one of our examples where we have the population data from the simulations that was done at the Carolina Population Center. One particular slice of life through these dynamic system models, where we look at a national population, international population, tourists that arrive for land-based recreation, tourists that arrive for boat-based recreation, and the demands on the environment through both of these kinds of tourists. So some of the take-home messages. Tourists arrive in the Galapagos. There are of two types, boat-based and land-based. And we have to keep in touch with what are they doing to the environment and what is their reach on the environment. For example, boat-based tourists typically buy an all-inclusive package. They spend little time in the communities. They're mostly on board ship, generally consume few urban facilities and few urban services. Whereas land-based tourists do not typically buy all-inclusive packages. They consume local products, local services, local labor. So there are very different kinds of tourists that have a different reach and different intensity of impact on the environment as well. The last one is about tourism and fishing. The fishing industry in Galapagos has gone through booms and busts. The top graph basically shows the registered fishers. Not anyone can fish. You have to be government licensed, which means that we can keep track about the number of fishers that move in and out of fishing. We can see active fishers going down over time, even though the registered fishers are pretty even across time. The bottom graphic basically looks at the two primary industries, lobster and sea cucumbers, and how they have gone through booms and busts and gaps in fishing seasons, and how these are important elements of the economics of fishing in the Galapagos, both locally and export to global markets. In this particular project, social surveys were carried out of 167 fishers. Some of those were full-time fishers, some were part-time fishers, some were occasional fishers, and some were inactive fishers. This was done by my doctoral student, Kim Engie, as part of her doctoral dissertation. A whole series of questions were posed to these fishers. And the categories of information about occupational portfolio and change, physical and financial capital, economic security and relative poverty, job satisfaction, demography and human and social capital were all carried out through open-ended surveys, so we could create different characteristics of our individual agents, trying to ask the question, what pushes and pulls them in and out of industries, particularly as they are pulled more and more into tourism as the dominant economic opportunity through a livelihood strategy that looks at fisheries but doesn't look at it so much from a biological point of view, looks at it from an economic point of view and how it is driving their particular choices. And so we looked at labor mobility methods, from part-time to full-time fishers, from occasional fishers to inactive fishers, basically through intensification of jobs in fisheries to the diminishment of employment within fisheries. Asking the question again, how are each individual household deciding what to do? What are the characteristics that are shaping their sets of decisions? So complexity, indeterminate pathways. There's a lot of ways to get to this. Were the tape of evolution to be replayed, all would come out very differently. The process is indeterminate. And what I show in this graphic on the right is if we have a large-scale fishery versus small-scale fisheries, the landscape is being evaluated. It is evaluated in very different ways with different intensities over different spaces. And in the graphic on the right is an amazing image of fisheries in the Galapagos. And so in the Galapagos, we're interested in institutional responses to environmental change. Because it is a Galapagos National Park, it is heavily regulated by rules and regulations imposed by the park. That means quota systems, that means licensing of boats, And so it is not a free opportunity to move in and out of fisheries, it is controlled. And so our models basically looked at a variety of mechanisms that we felt were important to understanding the processes of people deciding what to do in fisheries, how to move in and out, and how to move towards tourism and other likelihoods. In this case, we were looking at the ability of a fisher to age, to die, to move in and out of fisheries, and how we looked at issues of education, age, income, demographics of the individual household to try to model what was being done. We also looked at income levels as another way of trying to capture the processes of people moving in and out of fisheries. And finally, how to look at household wealth. All of these were modeled and more to try to understand the processes that are affecting human decision-making about how to stay in fishers, become an intensifier in fisher, or to become a diminisher in fishing intensity. Some conclusion about fisheries. Labor mobility through fishing was enabled by social connections, wealth, education, retraining programs that strengthened weak human capital. Former fishers have higher economic security and more adaptive capacities than active fishers. Active fishers in lower formal education are experiencing a constriction of adaptive pathways out of fishing. Recent shifts through fishing show a willingness to leave without higher wages. Adapting. The smaller fishing footprint means purposeful adjustments. More socially and political transformative adjustments are also being seen. But if we take this last case study, we certainly can see that in the Galapagos, job preference and transitions in and out of livelihoods are fundamental. That adaptation, looking at environmental circumstances, but also looking at the pulls and pushes out of fishing towards tourism, changes in tourism back to fishing, changes of El Nino, La Nina, as disturbances affecting human decision-making about job preferences and income and accumulation of wealth. Fishers may choose to switch to tourism during El Nino events and switch right back. So maintaining that resiliency of the household and the individual is incorporated in our models. But if we were to take all of these case studies and more and try to wring out or distill some of the things that we're seeing about systems and complex systems in the Galapagos, these are some takeaway messages. The experiments that we've provided, they do provide insights into what processes are involved, their scale dependence, and links to other processes, the generation of emergence and self-organization. Social networks are fundamentally important to try to understand links of individuals and household, the key actors, issues of power in social systems. We tracked in particularly core nodes of social networks that represent, for example, the director of the Galapagos National Park, the mayor of the community, the governor of the province, president of fishing cooperatives. All of these are issues about power relationships that are fundamental in such a society. Our models are all heterogeneous agents. We've tried to describe their beliefs, their preferences, their circumstances, their social networks, their behaviors, and how all of those are shaped through pattern and process relationships and the adaptive capacity of individuals to seek opportunities and to understand challenges. All of the models, and most of the models in the literature, also stumble upon uncertainty in validating models. Validating processes remains a central challenge because the underlying processes that influence the derived patterns are not fully observable across a range of scales, both space and time. And that becomes a significant challenge. In the future, additional efforts on process models, less about characterizing pattern, although advances in new measurement technologies that I use as well, satellite technologies, drones, 3D laser scanners to look at high-resolution terrain models, are all part of the new measurement capacities where pattern can be rectified and understood, but still, I think the money is in process understanding. Complex systems may challenge our ability to infuse complex processes into our models, cognizant of non-stationarity, cognizant of the near-term projections and the imposition of greater uncertainty with time and longer-term models. Most of our models are relatively short in time. We tend not to want to run models 50 or 100 years trying to understand the stationarity of the rules and the relationships that we impose, particularly in the human dimension, and how they relate to the environment, how the environment changes. So short duration runs. Feedback mechanisms that link human behavior to environmental patterns and processes are certainly complex. Measurement challenges persist, scale dependence issues persist. Intention is to predict behavior and to explain processes. They may be mutually exclusive, depending upon the scales, the parameters, and the intentions of the models. Lastly, creation of system patterns through parameter models may relate to observed or expected outcomes without necessarily defining the corresponding processes involved in the operation. Patterns can be used to infer a process, and processes can be used to understand pattern. Lastly, we've been asked in our Ecuador work to use our models to help inform decision making, to try to allow policy assessments based on the anticipation of different scenarios and what the outcomes might in fact look like. Some of these models are so complex they seem to impede decision makers in wrapping their head around the alternate realities and the processes that are informed those kinds of decisions. So in short, the Galapagos has been a wonderful natural laboratory. It is highly variable across the islands. We have an increased peopling of the Galapagos, bringing to it a set of crises about environmental resilience, about the number of people in the Galapagos, about how fisheries, agriculture, invasive species, political systems, policies are all being meshed together into trying to find a wise use of resources and a wise protection of protected places. Thank you.